instrumental in the founding of Boston Global Forum, and he's certainly no stranger to Asia. When he was in the Army, he served on a military armistice commission in Korea. He's been involved with the director of the Vietnam Program, Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at Harvard University. And he's also, I just want to say, Governor Dukakis is probably one of the most accessible government leaders we've had, long before we had Twitter and social media and all these other ways to communicate. Governor Dukakis discovered a very simple way to remain in touch. He rode the T. And if you had a question, you could say, Governor, what about this? And he'd say, okay, we'll look into it. And it was a wonderful, I'd say that's the first social media exercise. So without further ado, Governor Dukakis.
Thanks so much. Thank you. This is a celebration of sorts today because we're celebrating the second anniversary of the Boston Global Forum. And this was not my idea. Juan Nguyen, who came up with this idea, a number of us decided to work with him. And I think we've done some good things, and we're going to do more good things as time goes on. It's a pleasure to welcome those with us, some of you who are here with us for the first time. And we're going to begin by discussing a framework for peace and security in the Pacific, which is going to be our focus of our work, with some additions, which I'll get into later in our session. But we're looking forward to a particularly good year. Our third year. We've done some interesting things. We hope and expect that we can to demonstrate that in the Pacific, as in all parts of the world, it's possible for people to come together, nations to come together, and to create a framework in which we can resolve our differences peacefully, sensibly, and make it possible for all of us to be part of a world in which we work peacefully, collaboratively on the kinds of issues that we face. Ambassador J.D. Bindnagel has been with us for some time. He's a professor in Bonn, part of our discussions, and he's going to begin our discussion today from Bonn, Germany. So, Mr. Ambassador, welcome again, and it's nice to have you with us.
Yes. He may be. I don't know, maybe the signal is lost. Yeah, I think there's something wrong with the signal, but we can, I think. Yeah. His signal from the line is gone, so it may take some time to join us back.
Can we move to the next speaker?
Should we move
Well,
on?
yeah, when we get him back.
We've got Professor Ezra Vogel, who's an old friend of many of us and has done some very good work in Asia and the Far East, who isn't with us in person, but was able to take a statement, and we're going to try to run that.
Okay. So.
Here he is.
55 years of traveling to Asia and studying Asia. Some of the deeper feelings of people from the country, because I think that in order to deal with the current issues, it's necessary to feel the deeper feelings to have a really lasting understanding and cooperation. I think in the case of Japan, there is a feeling that they have apologized very much, that their leaders have done a lot that they have pursued peace for 70 years, that they made a great contribution to China in the 1980s and 1990s in technology and financial help, and that China has not shown appreciation. They feel that China is using the anti-Japanese movement and stirring it up in Nanjing and through World War II movements in order to unite people against Japan. They feel that China is now using the anti-Japanese views in order to avoid the internal difficulty, and that they have jumped on Japan and do not listen to what Japanese say. They feel that their leader, Abe, is a Yasukuni, only as a way of showing respect to those who sacrifice their countries, and that the Chinese did not listen to what he said, and that he said to pursue peace in the future. So I think the Japanese feel that they have worked very hard for peace and do not get that and that they want to continue to pursue peace. I think in China and South Korea, there's a feeling towards Japan that Japan has not shown sufficient regret about what happened in World War II. That the young Japanese people do not know about the horrors that they caused to other countries, and that they lack sympathy for what happened in the past, and that they have not shown sufficient remorse. And many of them feel that for over 150 years since the Opium War, the Chinese have been on the receiving end of aggression from many countries, especially Japan. And that now finally they are strong, and they do not have to put up with all of these difficulties. I think many of the Koreans also feel that the Japanese do not show sufficient sorrow for the people who sacrificed and who suffered, and that the Japanese efforts to play down the number of women is not showing sufficient appreciation of the suffering that were caused by the Japanese, and that they have better feelings. They need to have broader expression. Many of the people in Southeast Asia feel that they have suffered both from Japan and China. They feel that Vietnam particularly, that over the centuries they have suffered very much from the Chinese invasion, and they suffered again in 1979 from the Chinese invasion. They feel that now they must cooperate with China and Japan. They are strong countries. Many of them find it much easier to work with Japan because they do not feel Japan as a strong military investment. So I think all these underlying feelings are very deep. I think many of the Southeast Asians and Japanese also wonder whether the United States, with its financial authorities, 10 years from now, will be able to afford to continue to support what's going on in the American defense of the security of Asia. In the United States, we have many people who have very different voices. The press has one voice. They often like to make drama between the United States and China and to make it as if there is tension and no serious problem. But from the point of view of the leaders of the United States, there is a conviction that we are working to keep engaged in Asia. We want to provide security and that we want to cooperate. So I think that the countries now know that they need to cooperate on a global area, a global arena, and that they should work together. So I think that there are so many common problems to work together. They will look to the United States for security and support, but they want to build a basis for cooperation dealing with realistic problems of common needs, but at the same time, having sympathy for each other, for the past issues that have come up.
Thanks, Ezra. Good way to start our discussion today. Now, I think, Mr. Ambassador, we have you back and connected, so it's good to welcome you back.
Thank you very much, Governor. I'm delighted to have a chance to join in, and I appreciated Ezra's comments very much. So, sitting here now in Europe, I have a little bit different perspective from what we've been talking about. But the idea of the conflicts in the region are very, very real. I look forward to Tom Patterson and Andreas Carr's discussion about global threats. But let me give you a perspective from here for a moment on the South China Seas, in particular China and its relationship with Japan and North Korea and South Korea. From the European point of view, we're in the middle of a war. The war started in Ukraine, and it's driven by nationalism. And that sense of nationalism is seen here as a major underlying threat in Asia, East Asia. And dealing with the forces of nationalism is much more difficult than resolving individual conflicts. So what Ezra just said about the Chinese feeling humiliated for the last 150 years from imperialism, particularly Japanese, but also European imperialism, is sometimes described to me in the German case that the Germans destroyed the world in the 20th century and are now back in a leadership position. How did they do this? And I think that's an important point for us to look at what we did as the United States did in Europe to maintain stability and try to make that case with the Chinese that we are also there for stability and for cooperation and collaboration, which in the effort of preventing conflict and resolving conflict is really the basis of it. There are plenty of conflicts. There are a lot of sovereignty issues, disputed islands, as we know, and just individual issues on trade and transparency, weak institutions in the region, and I think more importantly the interest in China not participating in international legal efforts to resolve issues, either arbitration or the law of the sea, and trying to move from that in this framework that we've been talking about for peace in the region. There are some examples, I think, that are important for us to look at in the European context with the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is really the basis of human rights and peaceful changes of borders and things, all those things that Mr. Putin is violating today. And there's also the example of the European Union, while not drawing any analogies, but some of the thoughts and some of the ways that you could deal with it. So there are a set of principles that come out of this, and I think those are things that the framework really do need to focus on, and the reliance on international law in particular, but also, as Ezra noted, mutual respect and dealing with the crimes of the past and reconciliation, the sense of shame and forgiveness. There's an awful lot of unfinished business from World War II. But then there are also the structural issues, trying to deal with the principles that really are guiding this discussion in greater openness and balancing of power and avoiding an escalation of conflict. So what mechanisms are there? I think actually I would say there are three areas where the framework could really focus on. One is to agree on rule of law for resolution of disputes, that is not through military conflict. That's a very important one. If the states in the region could find ownership of conflicting claims through the International Court of Justice or through even the Code of Conduct that has been negotiated for a long time, there's a primary commitment to resolve issues not using force. The second thing that we've talked about in trying to set this framework up is building international institutions for consultation, negotiation, and cooperation. Of course, there are all kinds of efforts in that realm, from ASEAN and ASEAN Plus and and the Asia Summit and other issues, other structures that are there but aren't very functional or very efficient at this point. Even Japan, China, and South Korea could put together their trilateral group to address some of the issues in the Northeast Asian region. And of course, one of the more promising parts is the integration, more deeper integration and development of the economies into the global economy. Again, looking for the principle that one can build on the institutions that exist, on the WTO, on the international financial institutions, and not create competing institutions, or, in other words, to deal with the Trans-Pacific Partnership in a way that is seen as inviting to China in particular over time, and not that they need to find what Putin has done to create a Eurasian Union in competition with the European Union and create conflict, but rather to try to work through ways to do it. And then, of course, there are lots of small issues that allow us to implement this framework, from working with the bodies that exist, of course, creating more dialogue, creating exchanges, and dealing with natural disasters or dealing with economic development. The power structure is such that it's probably not in China's interest to do a lot of sharing, as long as they can impose their, or be the greater influence on the region. But nevertheless, I think we're on the right track with this framework that deals with threats. We'll talk about this a little later. A set of principles that we could move toward, and then simply finding ways to implement it. And there again, I would turn to the historical example of the coal and steel community that began for the European Union, dealing with some basic issues of fishing and development and resource development in ways that can bring the countries to work together. So that's a really quick view of the framework, and I'm certainly willing to expand on some of those. I've been talking about this a lot in Europe, and there's some very strong interest, particularly on the economic side, and particularly in the South China Sea, which has so much traffic and resources and in trade, particularly with the Germans and the Japanese. So there's an opening remark, if I may.
Thanks, JD. Thanks. It's been a pleasure having you as part of this, and we look forward to working with you over the course of the next year and years to come. I now want to welcome a new voice face to our forum, an old friend. Don Vallely served in the Massachusetts legislature when I was governor, among others. And before that, served in the American military in Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And the last several years has run the Vietnam program at the Kennedy School. He's now deeply involved in Myanmar and the effort to help that very poor country become a part of the local community. Particularly interested, obviously, in Vietnam, and has for a long time. It's good to have you with us.
and use a little bit of the South China Sea issue in Vietnam and relationships that China has with the neighbors that I deal with. And I think that
It's very relevant.
I think that we talk a little bit today about how does China deal with Vietnam, how does China deal with Vietnam, how does China deal with Myanmar, and these two examples, Governor, are quite different. Okay? And let me try to talk about that, and let me weave in a little bit of what the ambassador said about the American security apparatus, the TPP, and the pivot to Asia that was is the dominant strategy of the Obama administration moving forward. And let me just talk about how those things, how operating on the ground may or may not be.
So let me just add this. I think one of the reasons that your presence here is so important is because this is not just a China, Japan, U.S. game. We have other countries that are important. And one of the reasons that we're talking about the framework is to make sure that those countries are full partners. We can speak with that better than you. I think what we've been doing is very relevant.
But what we do at the Ash Center is something that's it's pretty interesting. We combine the traditional study of development economics with nation-building politics. We combine, we use both the economics and the political apparatus to look at and analyze the country. And we use a book that's recently been published called Why Nations Fail. And this is a book by Darren Ashimoglu at MIT and James Robinson at Harvard. And they basically make the argument that I think we'll talk a fair amount about today is a country can't just use economics. It has to use economics. When a country has inclusive economic and political institutions, they do much better than the countries that have very extractive economic and institutions. And so that's what we study. And so one of the things that we study, and this is an important thing, is we study the gap between Vietnam and China, the economic gap. So when I started working on Vietnam when I was so just let me put aside about Governor Douglas. I was elected to the legislature between he was governor. So the governor was elected, and then he lost to a guy named Ed King, and then ran again. And I was in the legislature when he ran again. And I remember his speech at the Democratic Convention, where, I remember it vividly. It was a terrific presentation he made. He said, look, I have something that's very rare in politics. I have a second chance. And so I was a failure and didn't take the second chance. I came to Harvard. He ran again and was a very successful governor. So I didn't do what he did. Okay? But I remember the second chance. So my second chance was to learn about Vietnam, and that's what I did. And when I started in this business, Vietnam and China basically had the same per capita. That's 30 years ago. It's a little bit different, but it wasn't much. Now, China has way outperformed Vietnam economically. And the per capita income of China is almost $10,000 a person, and Vietnam's is $4,500 a person. So Vietnam has underperformed economically with respect to China. And to me, that's a much bigger threat to China than the ocean. The ocean is not a threat to China. The ocean's a threat to the world, perhaps, in the trade, but the China-Vietnam issue is related to China's success relative to Vietnam's underperformance as a nation. What we, and we have a ongoing dialogue with the Vietnamese politics, the elite politics of Vietnam. and we make this case that if you want to make progress and to catch up to China, you're going to have to fix those institutions of the political inclusiveness institutions. And at this point in the debate between this debate in Vietnam, the facts, Governor, are no longer disputed. There's no dispute anymore. Oh yeah, the Harvard numbers are wrong. Yeah, blah blah blah. Everyone knows that the basic framework is that Vietnam has to reignite a form of economic and political reform to maintain its sovereignty against a rapidly more developed and more sophisticated industrialization that took place in China. China has a real industrialization that's cold, and uses the integrated world economy and private sector more than Vietnam does. Vietnam decided not to have a successful integration into the world economy at the industrialized level because they wanted to keep the commanding heights in the communist system. China let that go and is much more successful about that. And Vietnam, I think, needs to bet today that China's economic growth will slow. First of all, everyone predicts that it's going to slow. There's no one that says that China is going to keep double-digit growth for the next decade. Everyone thinks it's going to be half of that or less. And I think the new leadership of China is not particularly talented, and I think that they're using an older version of politics. So the strategy for Vietnam is China is going to slow down economically. Can Vietnam figure out a way to have a new reform system and get their growth to be higher than China, and then in a decade and a half, get the income levels between China and Vietnam somewhere in the same area? And that is the main China-Vietnam issue right now. And it's not on the ocean, it's on the land.
So the island disputes are there, but that's
It's not the main issue.
Not the main issue.
I thought Ezra's comments were very, very good. Vietnam also uses, to be that nationalism in Vietnam is determined by how anti-Chinese you can. It covers up the weakness in domestic politics when a politician in Vietnam says, "Oh, I want to make sure we protect our sovereignty against China," but at the same time, the forces in China and Vietnam don't really allow the level of protest against China that would normally take place. Tuan is an expert on this subject. So that a Vietnamese politician cannot give up land to China and be successful. So that they have to protect the sovereignty on the ocean. And I think they will protect it. I think Vietnam is extremely skilled at diplomacy. They're very, very good at this. I don't see a hot war between Vietnam and China. Vietnam would lose. A normal military conflict is Vietnam might have an asymmetrical type of war, but no conventional typical war. China's military is way too powerful. I don't see the only war I think is someone makes a big mistake, error. I think there's enough of what Ambassador was talking about and what Ezra was talking about. The institutions are big enough to avoid a conflict. The issue with China is, and this has to go back a little bit, just train of thought in, what is the pivot? What is the U.S. pivot? The U.S. pivot is, I don't know how public this forum is.
The forum is very public.
Okay. The
world
then
is
I need to
watching and participating.
I need to be a little bit careful about what I say about this. What exactly the pivot is. So let me.
Many of us don't understand it, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
So maybe you can help us.
Yeah. Well, that's the hard part. The pivot is a way to use international law and international institutions, and basically the status quo, to have China, in its continued rise, Governor, use the existing international framework for what their behavior is. That's what the pivot is. And adding to that, we are supporting a group of allies in the region, many of which have treaty arrangements with the United States, Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, and that the rise of the Chinese military in a balance of power sense means the U.S. has to make a shift from other places to Asia. I think that's possible and a good idea. And that balance is to ensure that the existing status quo system is the operating system of that region. If China all of a sudden diverted the Mekong River into making, using that water for another purpose, doing something in the Himalayas, having a different territorial arrangement with it, that would then change the international order, and that the United States military would be there for. So it's a little bit of a it's a form of getting ready for containment if you needed it. That's how I would describe it. It's a natural balance of power move by the United States and its allies. It is misunderstood in China, and I think Ezra has a touch about how to has a good feel for it. I thought what he said was terrific, but that's the reason they do it. Right now, it's a little bit of a myth that the Chinese military is that powerful. It's not that powerful. And so there's a few years here where this is not going to be tested. This balance of power is not going to be tested until Tuan has grandchildren. So the grandchildren are in the government. Okay?
It has.
I know it's going to be a while before
they're
they're
not ready for public service.
Just from Vietnam. Vietnam and China have a commercial relationship. So that Vietnam buys electricity from China at the world price of electricity. So whatever the wholesale price of electricity that's being produced in China, Vietnam buys it at that price. They have commerce back and forth, and basically they have a commercial relationship. Switch it to Myanmar. Myanmar does not have a commercial relationship with China. Myanmar has an extractive, neo-colonial relationship with China. And the way that China deals with Myanmar is completely different than the way they do with Vietnam. It's a natural thing that a very successful country, like China, very successful, is bordering one of the poorest countries in the world. So in a very dynamic country, bordering Myanmar. Myanmar is one of the poorest countries in the world. It's we call a bottom billion country. It's in the bottom of the bottom billion. It has had almost, let's say, 1% growth for 60 years. It's very, very poor. It has feudalism. It's not as advanced as socialism. Socialism in Vietnam, which is at its limits of what it can do, is a much more advanced social and economic system that works pretty well at the bottom. Myanmar has a feudal system. That feudal system is taken advantage of by a very powerful China neighbor. That neighbor can take whatever it wants, and it does extract. It extracts almost everything it can get its hands on, and that's in one sense, it's a normal process of a very successful country bordering a very poor country. Now, if you want to, then, if you're Myanmar and you want to build a new nation, which they're in the middle of talking about, the junta has been degraded to a mini junta, and the mini junta is deciding how would we now move forward to build a nation, and they open the thing up for politics for the first time in a long time to play a major role in what that would be. And one of the things they have to get right is they must have a good relationship with China government, but they must have a commercial relationship with China, so that the resources we were talking about, electricity and power and water, that that these things are shared properly and invested in properly, so that Myanmar would have a somewhat of relationship with China the way that a stronger neighbor like Vietnam would have with China or South Korea. So much more successful. So that's how the China plays into this. And China is, I agree with it. China is not always destructive. You need to get them to operate on a commercial term. But if Myanmar wanted to get out of the bottom billion, it does need to create electricity. Electricity is a necessary ingredient to economic growth. So to have 5% growth in an economy, which is not very much for Myanmar, you need 10% growth in electricity to get that. So Myanmar probably needs 20% a year growth in electricity for the next several decades. And it's going to need the resources that it has, not only hydro, but others too. They're going to have to take these rivers and make them work for both the agriculture in the Irrawaddy Delta and for power creation, and sharing that power with the ethnic groups, which is a different issue. I'm sure Charlie Sennett, that's one Myanmar will ask about. Myanmar is also not a united country. So that in this politics, Governor, the divisions inside this country are also exacerbated by the border of China, and not only China, but it's also, you know, a religious, Muslim, Buddhist war basically going on in this fragile country. So strong countries next to weak countries are very, very complicated, dynamic, and that's certainly what we have in Myanmar. We're also having this dialogue with the various political aspects of Myanmar, and there's basically 5 centers of elite politics in Myanmar. There's the military, there's the democratic opposition led by Aung San Suu Kyi, but there's a group of other smaller parties. There's the ethnic parties, which are about 1/3 of the population, and they have armed groups with them. There's the divided new government, which is both in the parliament and in the government, and they have different sides to them, people that want progress and don't want progress. Our thing that we do at the Ash Center is we don't have any horse in the race, but if you wanted to grow faster, if you wanted to get out of the bottom and use a democratic option to make progress, what is it that you would need to do that? And why this is an important thing at Harvard is no one's ever done that before. So in the modern development world, no one has gone from very, very poor to better off using a democratic system. Myanmar used an authoritarian system and went backwards. Most of the countries that Ezra is talking about used an authoritarian system, got to a certain point, and then used a democratic option. So we're trying to work with the group of people in Myanmar. It's, I think, not a particularly good bet that we're going to use a democratic option to get enough success so that more politics and development takes over. And I think it's easy to say if there was not peace and stability in Southeast Asia and Asia, this isn't going to happen for either Vietnam or Myanmar, because they need a world economy that has enough growth in it so that their manufactured goods, their labor is valuable in the world, so that the overall arching thing that the Boston Global Forum is working on, that neighborhood needs to be kept in that relative position for Myanmar and Vietnam to advance. So let me stop there.
Interesting thoughts, good thoughts. Suzanne Ogden, my former department chair at Northeast University, and my colleague for many years, is our China expert. And she's a part of this forum and sure has some thoughts, both in relation to what Thomas said of the future general.
Thank you. I just build for 1 minute on what Thomas just said, because I think what he is ultimately saying is that if we just focus on the maritime issues, we're missing the very important territorial issues that also affect a country like Vietnam. So Vietnam is not just involved with China at the maritime level. They're very much involved on the territorial level, sharing boundaries. And in particular, they have, as he mentioned, a very important commercial relationship with China, but also concerns because 2 of their most important rivers flow, their source is in China. And so, of course, China controls the upper Mekong, and they control the Red, if they choose to, the Red River. And these are important issues on which they need to cooperate as well. But I think what you're really pointing to is that there is a lot of cooperation in this, just as there is in the U.S.-China relationship that's behind the scenes. We focus on the conflicts, but we don't often look at how much they're working together. For example, there is the Greater Mekong subregion, which is an effort started by the Asian Development Bank to knit together all of Southeast Asia, including the Mekong, since it's in China, so including at least Yunnan province, to knit them together through transportation, infrastructure, roads, railroads, airports, and so on. And China is very interested in this. Of course, China benefits from all this, but Vietnam also benefits tremendously from this.
What about Myanmar? You guys okay? That out of your...
This is something I really don't have an awful lot to say about. I'm sorry, I've been to Myanmar. Matter of fact, I was there in, one day after the 1988 revolution began. I was there for an incredible 10 days in the middle of it, but I'm afraid I'm not an expert.
Any thoughts about the pivot, Ben? And some of the things that Tom said about U.S. presence in Asia. We have a few problems in our own states.
I think
adhering to international law, as we've discovered.
My
2 or
own
3 days when it comes to the conduct of our own affairs. How do you see that?
I think we did it to reassure our Asian allies that we were not going to ignore them. Sometimes I think the United States should not announce things like this. They should just do them without a lot of fanfare, because all of this has created tremendous problems with China feeling that they have to improve their military capabilities. And you can understand it from the Chinese perspective that, you know, we're over there in their area now that now that China is growing and has more power. He doesn't particularly like the fact that the United States is sitting on its shores and would like to do something about it. So I think announcing the pivot rather than just doing a few things, which is all we've really done, and reassuring our allies, don't worry, we'll be there. By announcing this, we have created a lot of problems. I do think in terms of the framework for peace and security, you have to build this slowly, step by step, block by block. And I think one of the best building blocks would be to negotiate an agreement with China that is all-inclusive, as you said, of all the parties about liquid fuels, because that's really what the island disputes are about. They're really about resources, but particularly liquid fuels and gas that is very important for China. And it is certainly possible, it has been done in other parts of the world, where China could be the source of capital and technology, so could the United States, and in return, China would get a certain percentage of those liquid fuels and
For its own use.
For its own use, but so would the countries such as, perhaps the Philippines, that don't have their own capabilities of extracting these resources. So, the whole idea of sharing natural resources and developing them together, if we could just start that as a plank of Pacific cooperation, I think that would be a good building block.
Climate change might be another, given the impact of the region and this agreement between the United States and China, with our old friend John Kerry had a lot to do with negotiating.
That's been very important. That's a big step forward. I don't know if, however, how the other countries in the region will necessarily, but that is such an important agreement. That's an excellent starting point.
Well, maybe a step-by-step approach in these particular issues that dealt.
That's right. I mean, it's sort of the international theory emphasized one school of thought is that functionalism, if you can cooperate on a wide variety of functional issues that to a degree degree you try to separate from political issues. Of course, they're all inherently political, but they're also very functional. You know, why are we able to fly to so many countries? Because there's been an international agreement. Everybody will speak English. They'll permit these commercial flights, and so on. You know, why can we exchange mail? I mean, these kinds of basic international agreements on functional issues make the world tick. And this would just be one more sort of functional issue you could start with in this area.
And in point of fact, the EU began with coal and steel
Began with coal and steel, right?
long before we had a computer.
That's a good point.
That's what we do business together. Llewellyn.
Okay, thank you.
A friend, our active participant, and the moderator of the well-known PBS series. Welcome, and give us your thoughts.
Thank you. My thoughts turn not so much immediately to Asia, but to China and the rest of the world, because from my rather view, China is still formulating a foreign policy. It's quite incoherent, actually. It doesn't seem to have a total foreign policy. It seems to be in Africa adventurous, de facto imperialistic. But when you get to Asia, it is not experimental, as it is in Africa, and probably in many of its dealings elsewhere in the world, where you have very complex things. You have China buying assets in countries where it will never predominate in any way, and yet when it comes to the South China Sea and East China Sea, China is a different animal. That ceases to be imperial, that becomes nationalist, and it's much more difficult to deal with nationalism than it is with a sort of rather experimental imperialism. Imperialism ultimately requires financial success to be sustained, to be worthwhile. This is a new kind of imperialism, where 48 countries in Africa have, to some extent, surrendered to China for economic reasons. Not a shot has been fired, not a gunboat has been sent. Than the old 19th century and 18th century concepts of imperialism. This is a new kind of dominance of easy target countries. And the countries of Africa almost entirely are easy target countries for that kind of economic imperialism. Their modus operandi has been quite interesting. What is astounding is how they found in a short period of their emergence, how they found a managerial class to run that global enterprise that they had. And that is hugely impressive. Just having a managerial class. But when you come to Asia, but particularly to the South China Sea and East China Sea, suddenly you're not into something experimental. You're into something very visible. You're into nationalism. There are not many ways to counter nationalism. The concept that the South China Sea, the Iron Dark Line, is somehow a very important issue to China is something that's going to be very, very difficult. And it's not going to be negotiated away in a hurry. We know that when we have strong nationalistic issues, economic realities kind of fades in relation to huge strikes. We also have this interesting situation where the Chinese population is not informed. Because there is no free press, it is not informed. So it doesn't have great opinions about many things, but it is informed nationalistically, and it is very strong. So we should understand that. I think that some of our actions have been foolish. I think we need clearly to have some sort of international collaboration on those aspects of the Chinese ambition in the oceans around its shores where international logic can prevail. Sea lanes, fishing, probably much less so in the islands. I think they are much more difficult. But I think it's very interesting that China has not used its military around the islands. It's used its coast guard. It is also probably a fact that we're making a mistake in China
as being more monolithic than it is. That its institutions, and we saw that Soviet Union, where its institutions were often quite in contradiction with each other, their ambitions, intentions, and ideas of what the future of that organization should be. I'm sure that this is true in China. We have these very powerful investments by the Red Army as a commercial entity, buying real estate, buying corporations. That is something we've never seen, but that will have to affect, in some way, inform actions of the Chinese military. This is a new kind of military that becomes not only a conqueror, if necessary, but also an investor. Never seen before. I think we can deal with China on nearly every part of the globe and negotiate with them and deal in the world of logic until we get to the nationalistic issues. And on territorial claims, China is not going to budge. What I feel is that the plan that China has, and it may not be a well-formed one as yet, is where its neighbors are concerned, Finland guides them, the way the Soviets did to Finland, keep them in this bear hug, which is what the Soviet Union did to Finland. I think that China would like to have Vietnam and its other neighbors in the bear hug. In some ways, it may be doing that already with Indonesia. And the recent conferences in China, they have fun with bags of money, billions of dollars scattering them around, because they found that to be a very effective way of getting their neo-imperialistic goals. And so I think it's going to be very difficult on territorial issues, and I think everything else is quite possible to solutions that are usually put under the umbrella of diplomacy and soft power.
Thanks, Mo. I don't get the sense that these other countries want to be hugged, however. We have to see how that works out. Whether our framework can make this less a huggable or a matter of real collaboration. It's been a long time since I've seen Charlie Sennott. Miss you terribly. One of the Boston Globe's best people. Those of us, particularly in this city, who read the Globe for many years, appreciated what you did journalistically, especially internationally. Now, we're doing something different.
Yeah.
And it's great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you to have you a part of this.
Thank you, Governor. That's really kind. I miss those days at the Globe. I think it's still a great institution, but journalism is challenged. So after many years as a foreign correspondent for the Globe, I could see that the newspaper world was really suffering. It's not a great idea to take and kill forests, turn it into pulp, truck it into a machine that then uses fuel to churn it out into newspapers, put it on trucks using 150-gallon barrels of toxic ink, deliver it to driveways where people don't read it, then bring it grudgingly to the recycling.
I go out every
That's
morning.
not a good
I go
business
out
model.
every morning and water.
Well, look, I do too. But that's because I love that experience. And we're a good breed, but we're a breed that's going to have less and less presence of circulation. The idea was that I loved being a foreign correspondent for the Globe, but saw that there needed to be something new, so I started Global Post, which I'm very proud to say I'm the co-founder of that with Phil Balboni, who you know also.
Tell us about it.
The founder of NACN. Global Post is a new international news organization. I can't really say new; it's about 5 or 6 years old now. But when I first started it, it was a glaring need for us to have a new form of international news, to really say, how are we going to do this? We have to have a new business model. So we went after this. We went at it hard. Almost 6 years out, I would say we're very proud of our editorial achievements. There's a network of about 50 or 60 freelance correspondents around the world who report every day for Global Post. But it is a challenge as a business. Just like newspapers are facing challenges, to do great in-depth online content is very difficult. So we have a new startup that I now am heading up, which is sort of my second act as a startup. I'm becoming a serial entrepreneur, Governor, but I'm trying to create some jobs in the Commonwealth. And basically what we decided was there could be a great sort of a companion nonprofit to Global Post. where we could continue to do the kind of work we want to do, in-depth investigative reporting around the world, but to do it with foundation support as opposed to the online advertising. So we've got a nonprofit arm called the Ground Truth Project, which we now base at WGBH. I am the head of that over at WGBH. We partner with Frontline, we partner with PBS The World, PRI The World, excuse me, which is in partnership with BBC, and with other PBS entities, and also just with GBH Radio locally. You know, my whole
Which is our public radio station.
Excuse me, yeah, our WGBH is sort of the flagship public television and radio station here in Massachusetts. They produce Frontline, documentary unit, they produce Nova, they produce a lot of the best, I would say, PBS programming. We're very proud
And
of
a great public affairs debate show.
Yeah.
My privilege to moderate.
Oh, I remember it well. So we're proud to be over there and still publishing on Global Post and still looking for partnerships. But I want to just stop for 1 minute and just say I want to thank you for this forum and for having me here. It's I grew up under your leadership in this Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and I just want to say thank you for your service. I want to also thank Tommy. Tom Vallely is a friend of about 20 years, and he is the kind of guy who, when I am traveling in the world, as I was a lot with this job, I could run into Tommy Vallely smoking a cigar in a hotel, you know, sort of patio in Yangon and strike up a conversation with him where I learn every time. Tom, I want you to know that I learn a lot from you. Yes, I did buy Why Nations Fail. It's right there on my bedside. I can't say I've read the whole thing, but I've gotten through the first 3 chapters. Okay. And thank you. Seriously, Tom, you've been a great help in us understanding that whole region. You always have, and I appreciate it. But Tuan, I wanted to say thank you. I met Tuan. I was really lucky to meet Tuan when we were first starting Global Post. I had the great privilege to travel around the world and build a team of correspondents and editors to start this new news operation, digital news operation. And it was quite a thrill to do that, and I picked up some very talented people along the way, including David Case, who is very knowledgeable about the region we're discussing, and who's a great editor and who's led us in a lot of different projects. David led the project in Burma, which won the RFK Human Rights Award. And really, I think we're doing great work. But one of my first trips was to Vietnam, where I met Tuan, and we had a wonderful meal at his home. And he really opened the doors to me in Vietnam. I wish we were doing more there, but it's hard. Very hard to do journalism in Vietnam. And that's right. And that's something you know extremely well. And that's what I think he wanted me to talk about. Right? So I will do that, but I will quickly say my discussion of free press in the world begins in the Middle East. And I think the Middle East is in the shadow of the pivot. When the pivot happens, that means you have to turn your back on something. And what this administration did was turn its back on the Middle East. And I think faithfully, and at a bad time. And I think we're seeing that right now. We're seeing it certainly politically. I think it had a lot to do with some of the ways in which the Arab Spring spiraled into violence, spiraled away from democratic journey, and fell back into the reassertion of these regimes. I think it had a lot to do with the failure of us to really get any progress in Israel-Palestine. You can't turn your back in a pivot on the Middle East. And I think that's something, my experience is 25 years as a reporter is concentrated in the Middle East. You'll hear this in my talk, and it's really my focus. But that's how I would view the pivot. In terms of free press in the world right now, there is a war on journalism right now in the world. And at Global Post and at the Ground Truth Project, which I head up now, we felt this very, very personally with the murder of James Foley. Jim was our friend, he was our colleague, and David wrote an absolutely beautiful piece about him and his spirit. Jim Foley was one of the most extraordinary young people I've ever worked with. He really had a sense of a commitment to social justice. He was a young freelancer who was out there trying to do the kind of work so many people want to do, and he was doing it in a way that's very challenging, without enough resources, without enough real mentoring, without enough training, without enough real close supervision. And it was a terrible and brutal way in which his life ended, and that tragedy continues to unfold for the Foley. The Foleys, so you know, are a local family in New Hampshire. Their son, James Foley, was the correspondent who was beheaded by ISIS. So we at Global Post and Ground Truth Project know this war on journalism in a very personal and a very deep way. But the war is larger than Western journalists covering the Middle East. The war on journalism is broad and diffuse. And the war on journalism is not just ISIS taking captives, holding people for ransom, and brutally murdering them, as we saw with Foley and Stephen Sotloff, and the journalist who was just killed more recently. It's also about a control of information, the levels of intimidation that can happen in a cyber context, or they can happen in a very physical way. And you see this time and time again across Asia in particular. You can see it in Fiji, you can see it in Indonesia, you can see this in Burma for sure, where we work very closely with young journalists. And I want to come back to our model there in Burma and talk a little bit about our experience. Certainly in Pakistan, I mean, murder and intimidation are the lay of the land if you're a journalist in Pakistan. We all know Afghanistan and the challenges there. In Vietnam, tremendous challenges. Legal and physical threats. The 1992 Constitution may say they believe in freedom of expression, but then they outlaw criticism of the government. And that kind of challenge to the media is huge. The war on journalism is also financial. We don't have a model right now that works to fund great journalism. There's the legacy media of the powerful networks. There's the legacy media of great newspapers. But the new media, Global Post, the Ground Truth Project, we are really in the Middle Ages trying to figure this out. We're going to keep pushing our way forward until we do. We're not giving up. But I want you to follow us. I want you to follow what the Ground Truth Project is doing and trying to improve that debate. And one of the things we're doing at the Ground Truth Project is to really try to train and mentor the next generation of journalists to do work that matters, work that seeks to make a difference, and to do it safely. These correspondents need more training, they need more mentoring, and they need more resources. The Ground Truth Project is very dedicated to that mission, but we don't believe in and great apologies to academia, but we don't agree only in education as an idle exercise. We want them to be out training in a real-time environment, through workshops, through seminars, and then publishing their work. So we have an array of publishing partners. Global Post is my dearest one, very close to us, so we publish there. But we also publish with Frontline, with PRI The World. On Huffington Post, we can hit 100 million uniques reach. So publishing partners are crucial for us to do this work and then get it out there. We think we can build capacity for freedom of expression around the world through the work we're doing at the Ground Truth Project. The way we're doing that is we're taking what we call pop-up newsrooms. We've done a bunch of them around the world, but the one I want to just tell you about for a minute, and then I'll stop, is in Burma. We took 20 wonderfully talented young people, 10 American, 10 Burmese. We put them together in a newsroom in Yangon, and we got them to work together with a grant from the Open Hands Initiative. And this team became friends, which is so important. They weren't reporters and translators, or reporters, and as we sometimes call them, and I hate the word, fixers. These were friends and colleagues working together as a team, completely equals, with equal resources, and the work they produced was stunning. The young Americans came from a very competitive pool. 500 people applied for these 20 slots. So we really had the top, say, 3 to 5 years of work experience is what I mean by emerging talent. We had great emerging talent. 10 Americans came at us with Columbia J School degrees, some from here, all of them full of a great spirit of inquiry, lacking local knowledge. The correspondents in Myanmar, in Yangon, came at it with great local knowledge and a sort of crippled sense of inquiry. They didn't want to ask any of the hard questions. And you put them together, and you get fireworks, you get pyrotechnics, and you get great journalism. So it's a training module, but it's also an exciting way to do journalism. And we're really excited about what it can produce and what we can do with it. we had a chance to then dispatch them out to 5 corners of the country to look at some very challenging issues. And it culminated with a beautiful event where Aung San Suu Kyi came and spoke to them. Very hard to get a meeting with Daw Suu. And she was told, we were told by her chief of staff, you have 15 minutes max. So give it 5 minutes for the meet and greet, and then you got 15 minutes. So we are leaving in 20 minutes. And it's going to be hard, but it's going to be fast. And we were braced for that. We had all this young talent ready to quickly walk Daw Suu through. They were so excited to meet her. She is the Nelson Mandela, I think, of our age. I think she's really proven to be a leader in human rights in an extraordinary way. So the excitement of the young people to meet her was really palpable. She walked in and she began to meet the different young correspondents dedicated to this idea of expanding freedom of expression. And as she went from each of their reports and heard them talk about it, she slowed down. Then she took the podium. Then she talked for a half an hour. Then she said to her chief of staff, I'm going to stay a while. I'm going to have dinner. And everyone's scurrying around trying to readjust the schedule. And it was a beautiful moment of seeing her engage with what you know, Tom, I think you called it, you know, this idea of the democratic option. Freedom of the press is going to be the cornerstone of the democratic. But freedom of the press is under attack. And we absolutely have to have mission-driven journalism that's going to go out and look for funding. Going to look for funding from foundations and individuals. Because the business model of online advertising will not support this. That's my ground truth after 6 years of trying to pull it up. But it will support great journalism if it's combined. If you keep Global Post going in the spirit of trying to make it through tough times, you have a great and committed team that will get there. I know they will be self-sustaining. But right now, the Ground Truth Project is going to set out to really have a mission that's a little bit bigger than just the profit margin of a startup news organization. But to say, what if we start over? What if we really go out and take this new generation that's so excited to do great work, and you unleash their talents? That's the future. We've done a big series recently called Generation TBD on youth unemployment. What we've found is there's an incredible convergence of these two themes, our desire to train young people and the need for them to have meaningful work. And if we can put that together, we would love to do, for example, in Vietnam. We would love to do the module we did in Burma in Vietnam. Could we navigate that? I can tell you, it wasn't easy in Burma. It won't be easy in Vietnam. But I think we can get it done. I think we could get it done in Indonesia. I know we could get it done in India, where newspaper growth is growing at 10% a year. Where just like immigrants in this country in the 20s learned to read English through reading their newspapers. We think that in places like India, that's becoming a gateway to the middle class, yet the reporters are poorly trained and ill-equipped. So I think there's a lot of room for us to work. I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I hope, I'm happy to answer any questions, but I won't pretend to be an expert on the region, but I will pretend and be very sincere in saying this is a very serious moment. It's one of sobering time for those of us who knew Jim Foley in particular, because it's really dangerous out there. It's never been more dangerous to be a journalist in the world. So we need to start over and we need to do something.
Very helpful comments, Charlie. Maybe it's because I'm the oldest guy in the room. I do remember past times. Journalists were attacked. Yep. They were killed. They were jailed. There's nothing new about this.
No.
And it happens to be in a world where the means of communication are much broader region. So I'm more optimistic, I think, although it takes you being able to do this. Even Llewellyn talked about the Chinese army getting involved in business activities. If I'm not mistaken, the Egyptian army has been at that for a long time. There's nothing new under the sun here, right? But in this particular case, because anyone around this table watching this doesn't want to encourage people like you and others to do this. And here again, part of creating a framework for peace and security is making sure that the people of the Pacific region, or for that matter, any region, are fully informed. And it's really one part of this effort we're talking about, to create a framework of law and collaborative conduct in which information is encouraged and not discouraged in some cases. So Jim Foley ends into it.
Governor, I'm getting older too, and I'm one of those people who was out there 25, 30 years ago in Great Pearl, and I was a young journalist, and I was taking great chances. I knew it, and I think you need to have a passionate commitment, and you have to have a sense of risk in order to do this job. But it's changed. It's not the same as when David Greenway was in Vietnam or even in Cambodia. Not the same as when I was in Iraq or Afghanistan. And I've covered very dangerous places. And I've felt the peril. We're in a different time. And here's the difference. Those militants who I've interviewed, I've interviewed nascent Al-Qaeda for 8 years before 9/11. I interviewed many of them. I was in the presence of bin Laden in the Sudan at the Second Islamic Conference. And the peril feels very close, but there was a difference back then. They needed us. We were telling a story, and they wanted the story told. The difference now, brutally and very starkly confirmed by ISIS, is they don't need us. They tell their story through the web. This is about a whole new set of rules. And I can no longer in good conscience tell young journalists to go cover conflict. It's really gotten to be perilous of a different order. And I would say I respect your sense of history. I share your sense of history, but I think we're in a different moment.
Well, those are good thoughts. Thoughts we want to consider. We have one more person that's going to talk with us briefly.
Yes.
We welcome her to our midst. She's Maribel Lieberman, Nacida en Honduras.
Así es.
Born in
I don't know if any of
Honduras.
you speak Spanish,
This
but,
country for many years. I speak pretty good Spanish because of the Spanish accents like that.
and it's very good. It's very good accent.
But she's been obviously in the U.S. for many, many years. An entrepreneur who's been very successful in the chocolate business,
That's right.
but also somebody who's been deeply involved in international affairs. And by the way, as a Honduran, I'm sure recognizes the fact that the Western Hemisphere is a very different place today than it was
And dangerous
back when I was a kid. But I think there's a greater sense of order, because we do have something called the Organization of American States, which has created a framework for peace and security in the hemisphere. Not that it's perfect, not that some countries, including this one, I'm sorry to say, think that they have a license to intervene in the hemisphere, but much less, Charlie, much less than we used to, because there is a framework for peace and security. And too bad that we don't like the guy that the Venezuelans have elected, but the U.S. is much, much more constrained, it seems to me, these days than it used to be, because we do have this framework that includes a charter, includes rules, and that even this powerful nation to the north now has to pay attention to. And I think in some ways that may well be a model for the kind of thing trying to at least begin to work on when it comes to the Pacific, for that matter, certainly the Middle East and Africa. Anyway, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. Gracias.
Yeah.
I'm very proud and very honored to receive, to be able to speak to you and express my experience in the United States and also where I come from, which is a country very poor and but struggling to get ahead. And this is why I'm here, because I share the sentiment that is going on with Vietnam and all the neighbor countries. I came to the United States a few years ago, let's just say. I started my company 14 years ago in New York. I came as a student and a student for fashion design, and slowly became a chef afterwards. So you never know where you're gonna end up after years. But the secret that I found in me was that I found what I really love, and that's something that everybody should try to find, because that's really the key to success. And what really inspired me, in New York, I was able to meet many cultures, and I love that. Everybody having their own great ingredients, and they all feel very proud of. And I feel that this is a way to embrace, everybody together, and that's what makes me experiment food and buying ingredients that I didn't recognize, but using them in my own cuisine and creating fusion cuisine. So that's how I started my life in the culinary arts. And I love it. I created a catering company. 5 years later, I created a chocolate company, but also only to give a face to my catering company. I was not planning to quit, but I didn't realize that the chocolate will still be show of my catering. So I just started going with my catering and with my chocolate, and eventually I have a boutique in Manhattan, and I also do business in Japan. I have 4 boutiques, and we sell international worldwide. I've been in Japan. I've been in China. Unfortunately, I haven't been in Vietnam, but very soon I will do. And I share, my opinion regarding what's going on. Is also has been the history of the world, that the powerful ones to get the weaker one always,
And we've certainly seen that in this hemisphere,
Yes.
right, for many, many decades.
For many, many decades. So it's nothing new. It's probably been many groups talking like this, how we're going to get it better. And I think, the bottom line, we all need to work on the young people, and to actually have, help them find their passion, and to do what they love, because this life is beautiful. We have all the resources that we have to get ahead, and it's not necessarily to have all the money in the world, but to be happy in the world. And I think that is something that I like to give to the young people. I like to tell my story, how it started. I didn't start with a lot of money, and just hard work and having fun while doing it. And so that is where we need to work also in the families, to have respect with each other, because if you have it at home, then you will respect your neighbor. I think getting the governments to respect the laws, the international laws, it's about also teaching them to respect their own laws, because sometimes they put their laws and then they don't respect them. And a way I feel that I could work is doing international agreements and do the negotiation. If you do this, then we'll give you that. That's simple the way I see it. I don't have time to tell my whole story, but one day I will tell you. But I'm very happy to be here and just give you my 4 cents in the subject.
Thank you. Good to be with you. Good to be with us. I want now to introduce the founder of this global forum. I first met Tuan when we were members of the same board, a nonprofit in Boston was very much involved in the arts, and we became very good friends. Friends also with an extraordinary man who was deeply and actively involved in the arts here in Boston, who tragically died of brain cancer. And it was Tuan who came to me and said, this is an incredible city. It's got some of the most intelligent, thoughtful people in the world. And what if we tried to pull them together, and then using modern communications, through this remarkable online conferencing approach, which he knows far better than I do. I had the last typewriter at Northeast University before I finally succeeded.
Struggle.
And poor Suzanne kept wondering when the guy at the end of the hall would stop tapping away into the wire. he was doing his work. But Tuan understands this world, founded the internet in Vietnam. He's now a part-time citizen of Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and really has been the spark plug behind this. So, on the occasion of our second anniversary of the Boston Global Forum, I want to say thank you to you for the fact that you provided leadership to bring us together. And I think all of us feel that very, very strongly. So, thanks, and you've got some things you want to talk about in terms of young leaders and the kinds of things we can do going forward.
Thank you so much for very we are very honored to work and learn from Governor Michael Dukakis, great leader, and I was enthusiastic at this moment. We felt here that we are starting 12 December 21st. And what lucky here we get a lot of contribution and support as all our big fans today. Yeah, today, and also many fans there. The month came here was easy as a Professor John Nye, John Brown, many great people, great contribution. And today, every year we have on quite a special day. This special day we have distinguished lecture, and today Governor Michael Dukakis will distinguished lecture with a message to young leader. We will organize Michael Dukakis Leadership Fellows program to educate and help enhance young leaders in the world under 40 years old. They are dedicated for peace and security. And Professor and Governor Michael Dukakis and our people here will come. We set up a new format for young leaders scholarship study. We don't ask them reading so much, not so much academic accent. That we are big time, we are accent time. Great leaders need, but it happens by activities. And Governor Michael Dukakis will help them. And for 1 week here, they will spend 1 week in Boston. And after that, they will come to vision to make it happen. Our framework for business in the Pacific and in the world. So today we are very honored to announce Michael Dukakis Leadership Fellows Program to start on today. And I will interact with my honor and respect with Governor Michael Dukakis. I will direct the program directly to the program. So again, I'm so honored to work with Governor Michael Dukakis, and I'm very lucky to have great teacher, great professor to learn 2 years so far from Governor. Great friends, special Tom Peterson, great friend from our Boston Global Forum. Tom Valley, that's great friend in my heart for a long time from Vietnam. Today, I'm very emotional. Tommy can hear and talk here with us today. And I hope Tommy continue great contribution and support and help us in the future. So honored to introduce Governor Michael Dukakis. This is lecture last year.
This is going to be. This is not going to be a lecture because we've had a lot of good thoughts and suggestions and ideas, and I just want to kind of summarize, if I can, very briefly before I hope ahead, and then turn it back to Tuan for some announcements about which your leaders ask 1 or 2 more of you participate before we wrap up. I've done a lot, needless to say, in a pretty long life. I must say this is one of the most interesting things I've done. And again, so much of it is the result of Tuan's leadership his enthusiasm, a wonderfully creative mind that he has brought us all together. But I think in listening to all of you, it's pretty obvious where the Boston Global Forum should be headed in the course of next year. There's a lot to do. I hear from some people that the world is getting more dangerous and so on. I'm sorry. I'm a child of the Great Depression. I was a kid during World War II. I did military time in Korea, not during the war, fortunately for me, but shortly after the truce was signed. We all lived through Vietnam. Tom, you were there. Tom, you were there. That was not a happy time in the history of the United States and around the world. It divided families, it divided communities. And then, of course, we've had to deal with, in my opinion, most ill-advised military operations we've ever had in the form of the invasion of Iraq and subsequently our military involvement in Afghanistan. So I view this time that we are now in as a time of great promise. I really do. It is because I'm a better optimist. You can't be in politics and be a pessimist. I think we can agree. I don't think that good people working together can make a difference in this world. We better do something else.
Charlie couldn't get elected.
Maybe he could. I mean, ethically, he's got the bones and nothing else.
This is the anything.
And I see a world, especially in the Pacific, which is very different from the one that I remember as a young person. Some interesting political leaders with a U.S. which didn't really have a good sense of where it was going. Something called the Cold War, which completely defined the worldview of my generation. And I think, Tom, one of the things that's been happening is that a lot of us are having difficulty getting out of that as we get. But a very different Asia and a much more promising Asia in many ways. Yes, China is a country which is doing remarkable things and flexing its muscles. Shouldn't be surprised to those of us who are Americans who know anything about American history and our own involvement in the world going back a century or century and a half. And yet I am a little troubled when I hear people talk about how we're in trouble because China may become a larger economy than ours. I don't know why that should be a surprise, given its size, the number of its people, or the intelligence of its people. And I don't know why that should be a threat to the United States, providing our relationship with China and in fact with the Pacific generally is one that moves on a positive path toward not only peace and stability and security, but one in which over time, and it's going to take time, those nations as well as this nation begins to understand that the only way we're going to build the kind of world that I think all of us want to is to live by a set of rules, internationally developed and internationally enforced. And unless and until we understand that fully and put ourselves to the task of building that kind of world, we're going to continue to have some of the things that we've been seeing lately, and of course, the kind of thing that we've seen throughout human history. In fact, I don't think it's too naive for me to suggest that we are at a point in world history for the first time where it's conceivable that we can rule out war as a means for settling disputes between the armed countries. I really believe that. But it's going to take a framework, both in the Pacific and internationally, in which the more powerful nations understand that they don't have a license to do what they want to do either, and that they're going to have to conform to national plans. That includes the U.S., it includes China, it includes Japan, it includes countries all over the world. I think I share, Charlie, your feeling that this notion that we could turn our back on the Middle East and go someplace else was ill-advised. The Middle East will continue to be a serious and difficult problem, far more in my judgment than ever. But I do see the Pacific as a place where all of us have an opportunity working together to demonstrate that you can create a world in which there are international rules and international institutions and where people can settle their differences peacefully. And that's why I'm so excited about the coming year for the forum, because we're going to get into this at great length, continue to explore many of the issues that we've raised as we approach 2015, and at the same time add something called cyber warfare, which, in my view, is one that must be resolved on an international agreement before we go out and spend billions and billions of dollars all over the world to engage in a new form of warfare, which can't end up in anything but tragedy and conflict and these kinds of things. So we're going to add the whole cyber warfare piece to what we're doing, and needless to say, it's a part of the set of issues that we've got to deal with in the Pacific as well as internationally. But I'd like to think over the course of the past 2 years, with the help of so many of you, not just here in Boston, but all over the world that have been participating with us, first in focusing on the issue of international occupational safety and health standards after the tragedies in Bangladesh and elsewhere, where, with, I hope, some contribution from this forum, we seem to be on a much better path when it comes to making sure that the folks that are making things for us to use are protected by real standards internationally implemented and enforced, and now obviously in this very important region of the world. I'm just delighted to be with all of you and be able to celebrate our second anniversary, and to look forward to what I hope is going to be a lively, interesting, and ultimately productive 2015, in which we do the best we can to make a contribution to what we hope over time will be a region of the world that can, in fact, deal with its issues and its problems, and do so with a set of international rules, institutions that will make it much less likely that we'll have to engage in containment strategies and these kinds of things instead, and much more openly and collaboratively solve these problems. But I want to say thanks to everybody that's made it possible for us to get to this point. And I must say I'm very optimistic about the opportunities going forward, and very impressed, if I must say, with the number of people who have come forward, some of whom are here today, others of whom we've worked with, who seem to be excited about this, see this as an important opportunity for us and for lots of other people to do very good things. And it simply reinforces my sense of optimism about this world. With all of the issues we deal with, more and more it seems to be there are people that share this basic approach, and that I hope can work very closely and effectively with us as we have a very productive next year. With that, I'm going to turn it back to Tuan. Tuan, where are you? And we're going to proceed with some discussion about our young leaders, and then ask one or two more of you to make comments, and then wrap things up.
Professor Gary Lowe, so introduce about young leader network for peace and security.
I think whether you believe that President Obama deserves the blame or the credit for the idea of pivot towards Asia, I think the underlying truth is that events in the world did the pivoting for us. As the governor just mentioned, according to, I think, the IMF, China just became the largest economy in the world. They now have a GDP of about $17.6 trillion in dollars, and the U.S. has a gross domestic product of about 17.4. And if you take the number that's thrown around about the global gross domestic product of about $78 trillion, that means that just the U.S. and China together are responsible for 45% of all the economic activity in the globe. And then you begin to look at who our trading partners are. Our biggest is Canada. Our second biggest is China. And in the top 10 are Japan and South Korea. So the economic entanglement that we have in the area that we're talking about is so huge, so important, and so critical to our own economic well-being that not paying very close attention to our relationship and what happens in their relationships would be deeply foolish. And as Tom and the governor have mentioned, the idea of containment, but there wouldn't be military confrontation unless there's a big mistake. The governor mentioned Iraq. Mistakes happen. One of the things that has happened within the past year is one of the chief naval intelligence people has pointed out that China has long trained for an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, and they have recently been training for an amphibious, short, sharp war with Japan. And if you look at the defense authorization bill that will be passed by the Senate probably about 5 o'clock today, one of the things that's notably in it is new funding for a new generation of literal naval craft, giving the Marines the ability to go in a giant ship with things that can just drive off, tanks that can drive right off the ship and send in a whole bunch of Marines on a place like a small island. So the possibility of armed conflict is very real. The possibility of mistakes haunts us to this very day. And the economic consequences that would befall us should there be an armed conflict in that region are terrible to contemplate. So the idea that the governor and Tuan had of focusing the attention of the Boston Global Forum on this area is really pressing. I work for a member of Congress who sits on the Financial Services Committee, and went on a congressional delegation trip to China this past year. And two of the most memorable things that happened there. We had a meeting with the head of their sovereign wealth fund. And one of the things he talked about quite dismissively was he didn't see that the U.S. dollar would be the global reserve currency in perpetuity because, maybe the yuan. So he was dismissive of the U.S. economic power in some ways. But the one thing that was quite impressive that he said that we really have a great deal of respect about what you do well is education. We really admire your education. We're very interested in having more of our students be able to go over to the U.S. because you train people to think outside the box. That was very interesting. So in some ways, what you do, what you say, what you think, what you try and push forward as good ideas is in some ways more amenable to leaders in China than the truth from the ground that Charlie and the free press may put out there. They are more willing to listen to you, to talk to you, to entertain your ideas than they might be things they read in the paper that sort of comport with reality on the ground. One of the other things to bear in mind about how brilliant Tuan's and the governor's idea is here is look at what people view as the most important consumers of new ideas. In television, which is part of my background, it is more valuable to advertisers to have a young person watch a TV show than to have an old person watch a TV show. That's because if you have two TV shows, one that skews 3 years younger than the other, advertisers will pay more for the 3-year younger thing. And I used to think, why would they do that? We have more money. And they said, think about it for a minute. I buy Bounty paper towels, but I'm 68 years old. I will buy Bounty paper towels to the day I die, which may be just a few years. But if you're a 20-year-old and somebody can convince you to buy Bounty paper towels, then you're going to buy it for 40, 60 years, and you're going to buy a lot more towels. So convincing that person, you see, just in the economy of the United States, is far more valuable. One of the other things you see is this very interesting piece by Pew Research about Americans' attitude towards evolution. And surprisingly, only about 60% of Americans overall believe in evolution, believe that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and that humans came along kind of late in the game. About 40% believe that humans have always existed in their present form. The really appalling thing about this Pew Research is that if you look at the tab breakouts, only about 72% of college-educated people believe in evolution. So that means that the entire experience of college only convinces about 12% of people that already had a preformed idea about evolution to change their mind. Another very strong message that you really have to get in early with ground-based truth, with the reality-based community has to try and have conversations with people at the earliest possible age, or you're kind of stuck. Because one of the other things that I really was impressed by in the meetings we had over in China was a meeting with this woman who was the wife of one of the former presidents of China. And when the subject of the islands came up, everything about her changed. And she began to talk about how one of the things Americans don't appreciate is the fact that in our war with Japan, they killed somewhere around 30 million Chinese. And when she spoke about this, it was raw and hot and intense, and it was as if it had happened in the very recent past. And there's still a way that Chinese leaders of a certain age are informed by events of the past that, as Tom points out, there are some things that are simply emotional, that are code, that are hardwired into the DNA of a generation that you respond to in a way that may not necessarily make rational sense. So when you take all those things into consideration, the idea that Tuan has come up with is even more brilliant, which is to create a young leaders network. As you look around this room, most of the people that speak are of a certain age, and it's great to see some younger people here. But what Tuan has come up with is this idea to purposefully go out and recruit a small number, perhaps 40, young leaders who are 40 years or younger, who have demonstrated an area of expertise, who have been consistently high achievers in their area, who can be thought leaders in their own area, and to bring them in to participate in the Boston Global Forum. To at some point bring a number of them here to be in Boston and participate in events like this, so they will then go back, and in a way it's like a really great Tupperware business model. You know, what you need to do is persuade not just the people that sit here in Harvard, but people that will return to Burma, to Indonesia, to Japan, to South Korea, who will come here, have this conversation, have the esteem that goes with participation in a think tank like this, which are increasingly being called do tanks, and then go back and begin to persuade other people to participate, to listen, to read, to go to the website. It's really an idea that I hope is not too far ahead of its time, but is certainly spot on. And Juan wanted to make the announcement today, the official announcement of the rollout of the Young Leaders Network that will be a part, going forward, of the Boston Global Forum.
Experience. Thank you. One.
So now, young leaders can talk about our mission. That is, Wendy Zhou Zhang she is a pianist painter and very successful and dedicated from the work in this and many places. Please, Zhou Zhang.
Hello. It's a great honor to be here today. Last night I thought it's a madness that I'm invited to Harvard because I never dreamed of the word Harvard when growing up in Vietnam. I was born and raised in Hanoi. I was born during the bombing raid and studied piano at the age of 8. My class had to study Russian. So when I came to New York at age 21, I didn't have barely had any English. So I went to Fordham University to study English, and at the same time I studied classical piano performance and art accompanying. And 1994, and I had a great opportunity to study with George Shandor, the student of Lala Bartok. And I'm thinking, my friend in New York used to tell me that you don't need to go to Harvard. You all have to do is just be a friend with Harvard. so today I figured that that's such a great meaning of that line, because I learned so much through all the speak from everybody. I would like to thank for the knowledge that since I walked into this room, I feel like after this I will feel like richer in knowledge, and it's a great.
We welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah,
I've been told that we're going to be evicted from this room shortly, so that's why you give us a little guidance.
Tom Patterson. Tom Patterson, because I thought Patterson had more.
That's a big shot.
Tom talked a little bit, announced about Global Street Index, one new initiative, Boston Global to support for framework for business security.
Well, thank you, Juan. So, the germ of this idea of Boston Global Forum goes back probably about 3 years. Juan and I just found some ideas around. There probably were about a half a dozen versions of what this thing could look like that fell on the floor. Then when we got together with Mike and John Welsh over at the business school, it started to take some form. The question always has been how to build it out, how to make it kind of a large presence. Obviously the one idea about doing the issue a year, I think, was a really sound way to begin to think about using Juan's skills with online conferencing, kind of intellectual resources that are here in the Boston area. I think that one was kind of right on. And obviously, you've just heard about the Young Fellows program. That's the second piece. Our ambitions are not over. We have more things coming. And one of those is we're going to create what we call the Boston Global Forum Global Threats Index. I will describe that in considerable detail because we're short on time here today, but I'll describe that in detail at our first session in 2003.
Great. Thank you. I think we're going to have to wrap things up, unless we be evicted. I want to say thanks to all of you, both here and around the world, who have been part of this. Next year is going to be an extremely important year for this forum with what we're trying to do. I hope one where we can make a really great contribution to peace and security in the Pacific world. So, thanks. Best wishes for the holiday, and we look forward to working with you.
And we're all going to everybody's invited to legal seafood. Just walk over.
So, Mike, I'd like to honor Michael's birthday.
More honors. More honors.
You don't take your photo.
Photo op. Photo op. Come on, come on, get in. Thank you. Thank you. Such a pleasure. Oh, thanks.
Oh, no worries. I'm just wondering. That's what the guy wrote. I love your tie.
Oh,
Can I get something Asian going here? I was in China and I bought my tax.
Now we are inviting all of us. So,
Yes,
they will give you a call.
Your result?
Don't go away without getting your box.
Then you're supposed to share.
No, this is for him, and then I have another one. Okay, this is the one for share.
For everybody? Why don't you take that over there?
So I want to listen. I want to listen more about the success.
Yes, we have got
Ai cầm hai đó mẹ, chắc phải nó to
Thank you for coming up.
Bye, Ander.
Bye bye.
Bye. See you.
Okay, bye bye.
I'll turn off the broadcast now. Okay. See
Okay.
you.
Yeah.
Bye.